The weight of one more. The rope stretched taut across the cliff edge of Hacksaw Ridge, its hemp fibers catching the last light of dusk as another wounded soldier disappeared into the darkness below. Private Tommy Nakamura from the 77th Infantry Division watched from his foxhole 30 yards back, counting the descents. 15 men so far, maybe 16. The numbers blurred together in the chaos of what had been the longest day of fighting on Okinawa since they'd first climbed this godforsaken plateau in April. The man working the rope moved with deliberate calm that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Desmond Doss, the medic who refused to carry a rifle, had been alone on the ridge for 3 hours now. Every other able-bodied soldier had rappelled down during the panicked retreat, following Lieutenant Morrison's orders to regroup at the base of the cliff. But when the wounded started calling out in the gathering darkness, Doss had simply picked up that salvaged rope and rigged it to the strongest tree stump he could find. Nakamura had stayed behind without orders, telling himself someone needed to provide security for the medic. The truth was more complicated. 2 weeks ago, he'd been among the loudest voices questioning whether Doss belonged in a combat unit. A conscientious objector who prayed before meals and carried a Bible instead of a bayonet seemed like a liability waiting to happen. Now, watching the slight figure work methodically to lower another stretcher into the void, Nakamura felt something shift in his understanding of courage. The rope groaned under the weight. Even from his position, Nakamura could see individual strands beginning to snap, tiny pops that sounded like distant gunfire in the humid evening air. The thick hemp line had been salvaged from a destroyed supply drop earlier that morning, never intended for this kind of sustained use. Each descent stressed it further, and Doss had to know it wouldn't hold forever. "Medic! Over here!" The voice came from somewhere near the collapsed bunker complex to the north. Japanese defenders had honeycombed Hacksaw Ridge with tunnels and fighting positions, turning every advance into a deadly puzzle. When their counterattack had broken the 77th's assault earlier that day, wounded men had been scattered across the plateau like leaves in a storm. Some had crawled to whatever cover they could find. Others lay motionless where they'd fallen, calling out only when they heard Doss moving through the darkness. Nakamura watched the medic secure his lowering system and begin crawling toward the voice. Every movement risked drawing sniper fire from the enemy positions that still controlled portions of the ridge. Earlier, muzzle flashes had lit up the coral outcroppings like deadly fireflies. Now, an eerie quiet had settled over the plateau, broken only by distant artillery and the occasional crack of a rifle from the darkness. The wounded soldier in the bunker was Sergeant Phillips from Ohio, a machine gunner whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. Doss worked quickly in the cramped space, applying a tourniquet and pressure bandages while whispering reassurances. Phillips's breathing was shallow and rapid, his face grey with shock, but his eyes remained focused. "Why didn't you go down with the others?" Phillips gasped as Doss fashioned a stretcher from broken rifle stocks and canvas. "Because you're still up here," Doss replied simply. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the improvised stretcher's stability. The answer seemed to satisfy Phillips, who closed his eyes and let himself be secured to the makeshift litter. The journey back to the cliff edge took 20 minutes of careful movement across the cratered ground. Doss pulled the stretcher himself, using whatever cover he could find, while Japanese positions remained ominously quiet. Nakamura provided what security he could from his foxhole, though his rifle felt inadequate against the unseen threat that seemed to watch from every shadow. At the rope, Doss inspected each knot with methodical care. The hemp showed serious wear now, with several strands completely severed and the remainder stretched thin. But Phillips needed immediate medical attention, and the makeshift aid station at the base of the cliff represented his only chance of survival. Doss secured the stretcher to his lowering system and began the slow descent, Halfway down, disaster nearly struck. A Japanese mortar round exploded somewhere behind the ridgeline, sending shockwaves through the cliff face. The rope jerked violently, and for a terrifying moment it seemed it might snap entirely. Doss wrapped the line around his forearm, ignoring the burn as hemp fibers cut into his flesh, and held on with strength born of desperation. "Easy! Easy!" voices called from below as hands reached up to guide the stretcher away from jagged coral outcroppings. Phillips reached the bottom safely, but the rope now hung in tatters. Doss stared at the frayed remnants and felt the weight of impossible mathematics. At least 4 more wounded men remained scattered across the ridge. Without the rope, they would die here. From his foxhole, Nakamura saw the medic's shoulders slump momentarily in what might have been despair. Then Doss straightened, muttering what sounded like a prayer, and began examining the Japanese communication cables that ran between destroyed bunkers. Within minutes, he was splicing steel wire into a crude but functional lowering system. The work continued through the night. One by one, wounded soldiers disappeared over the cliff edge, lowered by a man who carried no weapon except his faith and an unshakable refusal to abandon those who called his name from the darkness. "Dear God," Nakamura whispered to himself, watching this impossible persistence. "What am I seeing here? If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters." Lieutenant Morrison crouched in the makeshift aid station at the base of Hacksaw Ridge, watching Doc Harrison work on the latest casualty lowered from above. The stretcher-bearer teams had stopped counting after 20 wounded soldiers, but Morrison kept his own tally in a water-stained notebook. 23 men so far, all brought down by a single medic who should have retreated with the rest of the 77th Infantry Division hours ago. The radio crackled with static and distant voices. Battalion wanted situation reports, casualty figures, and an assessment of whether the ridge could be held through the night. Morrison stared at his radio operator, a kid from Michigan, whose hands shook as he adjusted frequencies. "How do you explain that your position has been technically abandoned, except for one conscientious objector who refuses to follow orders?" "Sir?" The radio operator looked up expectantly. "Battalion's asking about Doss. They want to know his status." Morrison glanced toward the cliff face, where the improvised steel cable glinted in the light of a flare. Somewhere up there in the darkness, the medic continued his impossible work. Earlier, Morrison had considered sending men up to retrieve him forcibly. Now he wondered if intervention might doom the wounded soldiers still calling for help from the plateau above. "Tell them Doss is conducting extended medical operations," Morrison replied finally. "Grid coordinates unchanged." Doc Harrison looked up from his patient, blood staining his surgical gloves in the lantern light. Harrison had been processing wounded for 6 hours straight, working with supplies stretched beyond any reasonable limit. The steady stream of casualties from the ridge had overwhelmed their small aid station's capacity, forcing them to expand into a nearby shell crater covered with salvaged canvas. "Lieutenant," Harrison said quietly, "I need to know how many more are coming down. I'm rationing morphine and bandages like we're under siege." "I wish I could tell you, Doc." Morrison wiped rain from his face and studied the ridge above. "As long as there are wounded up there, I think he'll keep going." The truth was more complicated than Morrison could articulate to his men. 12 hours earlier, he'd led the 77th Infantry Division's assault on the northern face of Hacksaw Ridge, with confidence born of superior firepower and careful planning. The intelligence reports had underestimated Japanese defensive positions by at least 50%. What should have been a coordinated advance had collapsed into bloody chaos when hidden mortars and machine guns opened fire from concealed caves. The retreat had been necessary. Morrison knew that, but ordering it while wounded men still lay exposed on the plateau felt like abandoning his most fundamental responsibilities as an officer. When Doss had quietly refused to come down with the others, Morrison had faced an impossible choice: force the medic to abandon the wounded, or allow him to continue what amounted to a solo rescue mission in enemy territory. Above them, the steel cable sang under tension as another stretcher began its descent. This one carried a radio man from Montana, whose arm hung at an unnatural angle. As the stretcher reached the bottom, willing hands lifted it clear and carried it toward Harrison's treatment area. The wounded soldier's eyes were closed, but his lips moved in what might have been prayer or delirium. "How's he doing it?" The question came from Private Chen, a rifleman who'd made the retreat with the others but volunteered to help with stretcher duty. "I mean, how's he finding them all up there?" Morrison had wondered the same thing. The plateau above was a maze of shell craters, destroyed bunkers, and scattered equipment. In daylight, moving across it had been dangerous enough. In darkness, with Japanese positions still active, it should have been suicidal. Yet Doss seemed to navigate the terrain with methodical precision, moving from casualty to casualty like he carried a map in his head. "He listens," said Corporal Rodriguez, who'd been helping coordinate the rope work. "Every time someone calls medic, he goes toward the sound. Doesn't matter where it's coming from. The implication hung in the night air. Responding to every call for help meant entering areas that tactical doctrine would classify as completely untenable. Enemy snipers, hidden mortars, cave positions that could open fire without warning. All the hazards that had forced the 77th retreat still dominated the ridge above. "Sir," the radio operator called again. "Battalion wants to know if we can resume the advance at dawn." Morrison looked at his remaining men, then at the aid station overflowing with casualties. Half his unit was wounded or dead. The other half was exhausted, low on ammunition, and shaken by the day's losses. The idea of climbing back up that ridge in 12 hours seemed like an invitation to repeat the same disaster. But something was happening up there in the darkness that changed the mathematics of the situation. Every wounded soldier Doss brought down was a life saved that would otherwise be lost. More than that, each rescue demonstrated that the ridge wasn't completely under enemy control. If one unarmed medic could move freely enough to conduct extended operations, perhaps the position wasn't as hopeless as it had seemed during the chaotic retreat. "Tell them we'll reassess at first light," Morrison replied. "Current operations continuing." The steel cable vibrated again, and another stretcher appeared at the cliff edge. This time, it carried a young lieutenant from Texas, whose face was wrapped in bloody bandages. As the wounded officer was lowered toward the aid station, Morrison caught sight of a small piece of paper tucked into his field jacket. A note, written in Doss's careful handwriting: "Concussion, possible skull fracture, administered morphine 2100 hours, responsive to voice commands." Even in the middle of impossible circumstances, the medic was maintaining proper medical documentation. Morrison shook his head in wonder. What kind of man thinks about paperwork while crawling through enemy territory to save lives? From somewhere above came the distant sound of Doss's voice, calling out to another wounded soldier. The response was weak but audible, and Morrison imagined the medic changing direction again, moving toward another impossible rescue. "How many more?" Doc Harrison asked, though his question seemed directed more toward the sky than any person present. Morrison looked at his watch. 3 hours until dawn. 3 hours until battalion would expect answers he didn't have. Desmond Doss whispered his prayer again as he crawled across the shattered coral toward another voice calling from the darkness. "Please, Lord, just one more. Help me save just one more." The words had become his lifeline through the longest night of his life on Hacksaw Ridge. 28 men now. He'd lost count around 15, but the steel cable rigged over the cliff edge had held longer than the original rope, allowing him to continue the impossible mathematics of mercy that had consumed the hours since the 77th Infantry Division's retreat. His hands were raw and bleeding where the cable had cut through his gloves and into his palms. His medical bag, once neatly organized with bandages and morphine, now contained only a few remaining supplies and strips torn from his own uniform. But the voice ahead belonged to another wounded soldier, and Doss had learned to follow those calls regardless of where they led. The wounded man lay trapped beneath a collapsed section of wooden reinforcement near a destroyed Japanese bunker. His leg was pinned, and blood seeped through torn fabric where shrapnel had found its mark. But his eyes were alert, and he managed a weak smile when Doss appeared beside him. "Thought I was going to die up here," the soldier whispered. His accent carried traces of Georgia mountains. "Name's Jameson. What's yours?" "Doss. Desmond Doss. Let's see about getting you out of there." Working by feel in the near-total darkness, Doss assessed the situation. The wooden beam could be moved, but doing so would require exposing himself to potential sniper fire from the Japanese positions that still controlled portions of the ridge. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet night. The scrape of debris, the wet sound of Jameson's labored breathing, the distant pop of artillery rounds from other sectors of the Okinawan battlefield. As he worked to free the trapped leg, Doss found himself thinking about the letter he'd written to Dorothy before the assault. Simple words about hoping to see her again, about doing his duty without compromising his beliefs. He wondered what she would think about this night, about the choices that had led him to crawl through enemy territory, one wounded soldier at a time. "You're that medic, aren't you?" Jameson asked as Doss applied pressure bandages. "The one who won't carry a rifle." "That's right. Some of the boys were pretty hard on you back at camp, said you were yellow." Doss continued working without responding. The criticism wasn't new. For months, fellow soldiers had questioned whether a conscientious objector belonged in a combat unit. Some had assumed his faith made him weak or unreliable. Others worried that his refusal to carry a weapon would endanger everyone around him. "Well, they were wrong about that," Jameson said quietly. "Takes something else entirely to be up here doing this." The beam shifted free, with a grinding sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Doss held his breath, waiting for the crack of sniper fire. But the night remained eerily quiet. Japanese defenders were surely aware of the ongoing rescue operations, but for reasons he couldn't fathom, they'd allowed him to work largely unmolested. Perhaps they respected the medical mission. Perhaps they were conserving ammunition. Perhaps they simply couldn't believe what they were seeing. Jameson's leg was broken but not shattered. Doss fashioned a splint from debris and helped the soldier onto an improvised stretcher. The journey back to the steel cable required 30 minutes of careful movement across terrain that shifted between coral outcroppings and loose volcanic soil. Every step risked triggering rock slides that might alert enemy positions or destabilize the makeshift evacuation route. At the cliff edge, Doss inspected his lowering system with growing concern. The steel cable showed signs of stress fractures where it bore against the coral lip of the ridge. Several wire strands had snapped, and the remainder stretched ominously under each load. Simple mathematics suggested it couldn't survive many more rescues, but mathematics meant nothing when another voice called "Medic" from the darkness behind him. "Lord, give me strength," Doss whispered, as he secured Jameson to the cable system. The descent began slowly, with careful attention to every sound and vibration that might indicate impending failure. Below, the aid station's lanterns cast a warm glow that seemed impossibly distant from the cold darkness of the ridge. When Jameson reached safety, Doss pulled the cable back up and turned toward the latest call for help. This voice came from near the ridge's eastern edge, where a machine gun nest had been overrun during the day's fighting. The soldier there had been wounded in the leg and couldn't move without assistance. But reaching him would mean crossing open ground that Japanese observers could monitor from multiple positions. Doss began crawling again, following a route that took advantage of every shell crater and destroyed structure. The coral tore at his uniform and scraped against his equipment, but he moved with practiced silence, born of 9 hours' experience navigating this deadly terrain. Above, stars appeared briefly between moving clouds, providing just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles. The machine gunner turned out to be a sergeant from Pennsylvania, whose weapon lay beside him in pieces, destroyed by the same mortar round that had wounded his leg. He was conscious but weak from blood loss, and his skin felt cold to Doss's touch. Hypothermia was setting in, complicated by shock and dehydration. "Can't believe you're still up here," the sergeant whispered as Doss worked. "Orders came down hours ago to pull back and regroup." Orders didn't say anything about leaving wounded behind. It was a simple truth that had guided every decision since the retreat began. Military doctrine provided clear guidance about tactical withdrawals and casualty evacuation procedures, but none of it addressed the moral weight of hearing voices call for help from the darkness. Each time Doss had considered following orders and descending to safety, another wounded soldier had called out, making the choice for him. The return trip to the cliff took longer. The sergeant's injuries required careful handling, and Japanese positions that had been quiet earlier now showed occasional signs of movement. Twice, Doss had to freeze in place while figures moved among the distant bunkers. But the enemy seemed focused on defensive preparations rather than aggressive patrolling, allowing the rescue to continue. At the cable, disaster nearly struck again. As the sergeant's stretcher began its descent, one of the remaining wire strands snapped with a sharp ping that echoed off the cliff face. The entire system jerked and swayed, threatening to collapse entirely. Doss wrapped the cable around his waist and held on, while men below called up encouragement and warnings. The stretcher reached bottom safely, but the lowering system was now held together more by prayer than engineering. Doss stared at the failing cable and calculated distances, loads, and mathematical probabilities that suggested his next rescue would also be his last. From somewhere in the darkness came another voice. "Help me. Please, somebody help me." Doss closed his eyes and whispered his prayer once more. "Just one more, Lord. Please help me save just one more." Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The cable snapped as Corporal Williams from Alabama reached the halfway point of his descent from Hacksaw Ridge. For one terrible moment, the wounded soldier swayed in space, held only by Desmond Doss's desperate grip on steel wire that was cutting deeper into his already raw palms with each passing second. 30 feet below, voices shouted warnings and encouragement from the aid station. Lieutenant Morrison and his men scrambled to position themselves beneath the dangling stretcher, but the cliff face angled outward just enough to make a direct catch impossible. Everything depended on Doss's ability to arrest the fall and lower Williams. The remaining distance hand over hand. The weight felt impossible. Williams was a big man, made heavier by waterlogged equipment and the dead weight of unconsciousness. But Doss had made a promise to himself hours earlier. No one would be left behind on this ridge. Not while he still had strength to move and hands to grip a rope. "Hold on, Williams," he whispered, though the wounded soldier couldn't hear him. Almost there, almost home. Inch by agonizing inch, Doss fed the remaining cable through his burning hands. The steel wire had been spliced from Japanese communication lines, never designed for sustained lowering operations. Each strand was razor-thin, and they cut like knives as the weight of the stretcher tested every connection. Blood from his palms made the wire slippery, forcing him to grip harder and accept deeper cuts. From his position on the ridge, Private Nakamura watched the impossible rescue with a mixture of awe and terror. He'd been providing security for Doss all night, though his rifle felt useless against the moral questions raised by what he was witnessing. This was the 31st wounded soldier lowered from Hacksaw Ridge since the 77th Infantry Division's retreat. 31 men who would have died without the stubborn faith of a medic who refused to carry a weapon. The stretcher touched ground with gentle precision, guided by careful hands that lifted Williams clear and carried him toward Doc Harrison's treatment area. Below, someone shouted, "Cables up!" and began the process of raising the empty lowering system back to the ridge. But as the steel wire rose through the darkness, Doss could see that it was finished. Too many strands had snapped under Williams' weight. The improvised system had reached the end of its useful life. He stared at his bleeding hands and tried to calculate resources and possibilities. Somewhere behind him, at least 2 more wounded soldiers waited for rescue. He'd heard their voices calling intermittently through the night, growing weaker as shock and blood loss took their toll. Without a lowering system, they would die on this ridge. "Think," he whispered to himself. "There has to be another way." The answer came from an unlikely source. Enemy equipment scattered around the destroyed Japanese positions. Communications wire, rope from supply bunkers, even leather strapping from abandoned packs could be spliced together into something functional. It wouldn't be pretty, and it certainly wouldn't meet any engineering standards, but it might hold together long enough for 2 more rescues. Working by feel in the darkness, Doss began gathering materials. Japanese positions yielded surprising resources when examined carefully. The enemy had been well supplied with communications equipment, and their defensive positions contained rope and wire in various gauges. Some appeared to be booby-trapped, but Doss's medical training had taught him to work carefully with his hands, and he managed to salvage what he needed without triggering any unpleasant surprises. The splicing work took nearly an hour. Each connection had to be tested and retested, with particular attention to the knots that would bear the most weight during lowering operations. Doss had learned rope work during his civilian years, but combat conditions added complications he'd never practiced. Everything had to be done silently, in near total darkness, with hands that were already damaged and growing numb from blood loss. As he worked, his mind wandered to the men below. Lieutenant Morrison had shown remarkable restraint by not ordering the rescue operation terminated. Doctrine clearly supported pulling back and regrouping, but Morrison seemed to understand that something larger was happening on this ridge. Each wounded soldier brought down safely demonstrated that the position wasn't completely under enemy control. More importantly, it proved that American soldiers didn't abandon their own, regardless of circumstances. The first voice called from near the eastern edge of the ridge. "Medic! Over here!" The wounded soldier turned out to be a radio operator from Wisconsin, whose equipment lay shattered around him like electronic confetti. A mortar round had exploded close enough to pepper him with shrapnel while destroying his communications gear. He was conscious but weak, and his uniform was soaked with blood from multiple small wounds. "How many others are left up here?" the radio operator whispered as Doss applied bandages. "Just one more after you. And then? Then I'll come down too." It was the first time Doss had spoken those words aloud, though the decision had been forming in his mind for the past hour. 32 rescues represented the mathematical limit of what one man could accomplish under these conditions. His supplies were exhausted, his improvised equipment was failing, and his own physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. There came a point where stubbornness crossed the line into suicide, and Doss had no intention of making Dorothy a widow for the sake of misplaced heroism. The return trip to his improvised lowering system took 40 minutes of careful movement across increasingly familiar terrain. During the long night, Doss had memorized every shell crater, every destroyed bunker, every safe route between the scattered wounded and his evacuation point. The ridge had become a mental map etched in fear, faith, and the desperate mathematics of mercy. The new cable system performed adequately, though it stretched more than Doss liked under the radio operator's weight. The descent took longer than previous rescues, requiring constant adjustments to account for the improvised equipment's unpredictable behavior. But the wounded soldier reached safety, becoming number 32 in Doss's private tally. As the lowering system came back up, Doss turned toward the last voice that had called for help. This wounded soldier lay somewhere near the ridge's northern edge, in an area where Japanese positions offered excellent fields of fire. Getting there would require crossing the most dangerous ground Doss had faced all night, but he'd made a promise to himself: just one more. The crawl across open ground took 30 minutes of careful movement that tested every stealth technique he'd learned during training. Japanese positions remained ominously quiet, but Doss could feel eyes watching from the darkness. Twice he had to freeze in place while figures moved among distant bunkers. His breathing seemed loud enough to wake the dead, and his equipment created tiny sounds that might betray his position to alert sentries. The last wounded soldier was a young private from Oregon, whose leg had been nearly severed by shrapnel. He'd been bleeding slowly for hours, and his skin felt cold and clammy to Doss's touch. This would be a race against time and blood loss, with no margin for error during the evacuation. "What's your name, son?" "Miller. Billy Miller. From Portland." "Well, Billy, we're going to get you home. Just hold on a little longer." As Doss worked to stabilize the massive leg wound, he found himself praying not just for strength, but for wisdom. This rescue would push both his improvised equipment and his own physical condition beyond any reasonable limits. If the cable failed during Miller's descent, 2 men would die instead of 1. But the alternative, leaving Billy Miller to bleed out alone on this ridge, was unthinkable. Years later, when reporters asked Desmond Doss about the moment he decided to stay on Hacksaw Ridge, he would give the simple answer they expected: duty to his fellow soldiers and faith in God's protection. What he never told them was the secret that lived beneath that final rescue, the moment when his courage nearly broke entirely. Billy Miller was dying. Despite the tourniquets and pressure bandages, blood continued seeping through his torn uniform as Doss prepared him for the dangerous journey back to the evacuation point. The young private from Oregon had been lying in that shell crater for 6 hours, and shock was setting in despite everything Doss could do to warm him and maintain his blood pressure. Halfway back to the cliff edge, Miller began having convulsions. Doss dropped to the ground beside the makeshift stretcher and felt panic rise in his throat like bile. This was beyond his medical training, beyond the simple first aid techniques that had sustained 32 previous rescues. Miller's body was shutting down from massive blood loss, and without immediate surgical intervention, he would die within minutes. For the first time that night, Doss found himself praying not for strength, but for permission to give up. "Lord, I can't save this one. He's dying anyway. Please don't make me watch him die while I try." The prayer felt like blasphemy, even as he spoke it. Everything Doss believed about the sanctity of life rebelled against the mathematics of military triage. But something inside him, some deep reserve of courage that had sustained him through the longest night of his life, had finally reached empty. He sat beside Miller's convulsing form and wept. The tears came without warning, carrying the accumulated weight of 32 rescues, 9 hours of impossible decisions, and the realization that faith alone might not be enough to save this last wounded soldier. Around them the ridge lay quiet, except for distant artillery and the wet sound of Miller's labored breathing. It was Private Nakamura who found them there. The rifleman had finally abandoned his security position and followed Doss toward the last rescue, driven by a combination of worry and guilt. When he discovered the medic sitting motionless beside a dying soldier, Nakamura felt his own understanding of heroism shift permanently. "Doss, you all right? He's dying. I can't. There's nothing more I can do." Nakamura looked at Miller's grey face and understood immediately. The kid was minutes away from bleeding out, too far gone for anything short of a miracle, but something about seeing Doss's tears made the rifleman angry, not at the medic, but at the universe that would demand so much from one man. "Maybe there's nothing more you can do," Nakamura said quietly, "but we can still get him off this ridge. We can still get him home." It was the simplest truth, but it cut through Doss's despair like a blade. Miller might die during the evacuation. He might die in the aid station below, but he wouldn't die alone and forgotten on this plateau, another casualty left behind in the chaos of retreat. They worked together to stabilize the stretcher, with Nakamura providing security, while Doss made final adjustments to Miller's bandages. The young private was unconscious now, his breathing shallow and irregular, but his heart was still beating, and that was enough to justify one more impossible rescue. The journey back to the cliff edge took 40 minutes of the most careful movement either man had ever attempted. Twice, Miller stopped breathing entirely, forcing them to halt, while Doss performed rescue breathing that probably saved the soldier's life. Japanese positions remained quiet, but both men could feel eyes watching from the darkness. At the evacuation point, Doss's improvised cable system looked even worse than he'd feared. The spliced wire showed stress fractures throughout its length, and several connections had worked loose under the strain of previous rescues. Loading Miller's weight onto this failing system felt like attempted murder, but Nakamura solved the problem with desperate ingenuity. Using his rifle sling and equipment strapping, he created a backup system that would catch Miller if the primary cable failed. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't regulation, but it doubled their chances of getting the wounded soldier to the aid station alive. "I'll go down with him," Nakamura said. "Extra hands to guide the stretcher." "You don't have to do that." "Yeah, I do. After what I've seen tonight, I do." The descent became a controlled disaster that somehow worked. The primary cable snapped twice during Miller's lowering, but Nakamura's backup system caught him both times. Willing hands below guided the stretcher away from the worst outcroppings, and Doc Harrison was ready with plasma and surgical instruments the moment Miller reached the aid station. When the empty cable came back up for Doss, he found himself reluctant to leave. The ridge had become familiar territory during his long night of rescues, and descending to safety felt like abandoning something sacred. But as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, he could hear voices below calling his name. The evacuation was surreal. One moment, Doss was alone on a plateau that had consumed 9 hours of his life. The next, he was surrounded by soldiers who looked at him like he'd performed some kind of miracle. Lieutenant Morrison attempted to count the rescued. 33 men lowered from Hacksaw Ridge by a medic who'd carried no weapon except his faith. "How many were lost?" Doss asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "None," Morrison replied quietly. "Not a single man you brought down died in the aid station, not even Miller. It was impossible mathematics that defied everything Doss understood about combat medicine and survival rates. 33 wounded soldiers, many critically injured, all evacuated alive from a position that should have been a death trap. The reporters would later call it miraculous, and perhaps it was. But Doss knew the secret weight behind the miracle, the moment when his courage had failed entirely, when he'd been ready to abandon Billy Miller rather than watch him die during a hopeless rescue attempt. The legend would speak of unshakable faith and impossible heroism. The reality included tears, despair, and a prayer asking God for permission to give up. The secret would stay with him for the rest of his life. Not shame, but understanding. True courage wasn't the absence of fear or despair. It was the decision to keep moving forward, despite both, supported by friends like Nakamura, who refused to let you carry impossible burdens alone. As medics tended to Doss's injured hands and Morrison filed his after-action report, the improvised cable still hung from Hacksaw Ridge like a mechanical rosary. It would remain there for days, a testament to what ordinary men could accomplish when stubbornness and faith combined with desperate necessity. But for Doss, the real testament would always be simpler. The sound of Billy Miller's voice, weak but alive, calling "thank you" from a hospital stretcher 3 days later. 3 months later, Sitting in a hospital bed at a Navy medical facility in San Francisco, Desmond Doss tried to explain to the chaplain why he couldn't sleep through the night anymore. The Purple Heart lay in its presentation box on the bedside table, awarded for shrapnel wounds he'd received during a later action on Okinawa. But it wasn't physical pain that kept him awake until dawn. "I keep hearing the rope," Doss told Chaplain Williams during one of their regular sessions. "That sound it made when the fibers started snapping, like tiny gunshots in the dark." The chaplain, an older man who'd served in the previous war, nodded with understanding. He'd seen this before in men who'd pushed themselves beyond the normal boundaries of courage and endurance. The human mind had ways of storing experiences that were too large to process immediately, and sometimes those memories emerged later in unexpected forms. What troubled Doss most wasn't the danger he'd faced on Hacksaw Ridge, but the mathematics of it. 33 wounded soldiers lowered over a cliff edge using improvised equipment that should have failed catastrophically. The after-action reports described it in clean, clinical language that bore no resemblance to the terror and exhaustion he remembered. How do you reconcile 9 hours of desperate improvisation with a citation that makes it sound like divine intervention? "The newspapers are calling you a hero," Chaplain Williams observed gently. "How does that sit with you? Heroes don't cry beside dying soldiers and ask God to let them give up." It was the first time Doss had spoken about that moment with Billy Miller, when his courage had cracked entirely and only Private Nakamura's arrival had prevented total collapse. The official accounts wouldn't mention that detail. Heroes weren't supposed to reach the end of their strength, weren't supposed to need help from ordinary riflemen who'd once questioned their place in a combat unit. The truth was more complicated and more human than any citation could capture. Yes, faith had sustained him through the longest night of his life, but so had stubbornness, fear of disappointing the wounded soldiers who called his name, and simple refusal to accept that some situations were hopeless. The rope and cable hadn't held because of miracles. They'd held because Doss had spliced them with obsessive care and tested every connection twice. But that wasn't the story the newspapers wanted to tell. Americans needed heroes in 1945, symbols of courage and righteousness that could justify the terrible cost of global war. Desmond Doss, the conscientious objector who'd saved 33 men without firing a shot, fit that narrative perfectly. The reality, a terrified young man whispering prayers while blood from his palms made steel cables slippery, was too complicated for headlines. The letters from families helped more than any official recognition. Billy Miller's mother had written from Portland, describing her son's recovery and his plans to finish college on the GI Bill. Sergeant Phillips from Ohio sent updates on his rehabilitation, including photographs of him walking with canes. Each letter represented a life that had continued beyond Hacksaw Ridge, choices and dreams that wouldn't have existed without 9 hours of impossible stubbornness in the darkness. Private Nakamura visited once before shipping home to California. The rifleman looked older than his years, marked by experiences that had changed his understanding of courage and faith. They didn't talk much about the ridge itself, but Nakamura brought news from the other survivors. Men scattered across various hospitals and rehabilitation centers, slowly rebuilding lives, interrupted by war. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd followed orders that night?" Nakamura asked as his visit ended. "If you'd come down with the rest of us." "Every day," Doss replied. 33 families would be writing different kinds of letters. It was simple mathematics that carried unbearable weight. Every choice created alternate histories, paths not taken that echoed in the imagination. Doss understood that his decision to stay had saved specific lives, but he also knew that other men in other situations had made different choices that were equally valid. Heroism wasn't a competition, and survival often depended more on circumstance than character. The nightmares, when they came, weren't about Japanese soldiers or artillery fire. They were about the rope breaking during a rescue, about reaching for voices in the darkness and finding no one there. Sometimes he dreamed that he'd miscounted, that one wounded soldier remained on the ridge while he descended to safety. He would wake in cold sweat, counting names and faces until dawn convinced him that the mathematics were correct. Dorothy visited whenever her nursing duties allowed, bringing news from home and plans for their future together. She understood without explanation why crowds and ceremonies left him exhausted, why he preferred quiet conversations to public recognition. The man who'd returned from Okinawa carried the same faith and gentle humor she'd fallen in love with, but he also carried memories that would never fully translate into civilian experience. "Will you tell our children about the ridge?" she asked during one visit. "Someday, when they're old enough to understand that heroes are just people who were too stubborn to quit when quitting made sense." Years would pass before Doss could speak publicly about Hacksaw Ridge without feeling like an imposter. The Congressional Medal of Honor ceremony was a blur of handshakes and photographs that seemed to involve someone else entirely. How do you explain that the man who'd earned the nation's highest recognition for valor had spent crucial moments weeping beside a dying soldier and begging God for permission to give up? But time brought perspective, and perspective brought acceptance. The legend of Hacksaw Ridge would inspire other young people to consider how they might respond when impossible situations demanded everything they had. If some of those people found courage in Doss's story, then the simplification was worthwhile. The real lesson, he eventually realized, wasn't about supernatural protection or unshakable faith. It was about the power of refusing to accept that any situation was completely hopeless, about the mathematics of stubborn love applied one person at a time. The rope had held not because of miracles, but because careful hands had spliced it with obsessive attention to every detail that might mean the difference between life and death. Late at night, when sleep wouldn't come and the sound of snapping wire echoed in his memory, Doss would remember the voices calling thank you from hospital stretchers and family letters. 33 men who'd gone home to build lives and families, to experience ordinary joy and sorrow that wouldn't have existed without 9 hours on a ridge in Okinawa. That was enough mathematics for any lifetime. As rain drummed against the hospital windows and dawn remained hours away, Doss would close his eyes and whisper the prayer that had sustained him through the longest night of his life. "Just one more, Lord. Help me save just one more." In memory, the prayer would always be answered. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.